I call to order the Financial Review Committee meeting of May 22nd, 2019 at 4:03 p.m. At this time, I will take a roll call of the Financial Review Committee members. When I call your name, please answer with present. Member Orlando?
Present.
Member Peterson?
Present.
Member Miller?
Present.
Member Wyatt?
Present.
Member Denny?
Present.
For the record, all members of the Financial Review Committee are present.
And this is being recorded.
And this is being recorded.
Okay.
That brings us to the public comments portion of the agenda. There are no public comments. At this time, Member Denny will conduct the new business portion of the agenda.
So, these are meant to be informal meetings, sitting around a table so that we can have sort of working discussions. But we do need to organize the Financial Review Committee, and when it existed in this form historically, the mayor and the mayor pro tem were the leadership because you're the, elected mayor pro tem of the city. So, if everyone's comfortable with that, then Joe as mayor, you would just preside.
Okay.
And Paul pro tem, when the mayor's not there. So, does that sound acceptable to everybody?
Yep.
Sure.
So I can,
Motion.
Do we need a motion?
I'll move it.
Second. Any opposition? All right.
Congratulations.
Ooh, another chair position.
Where's your hammer?
It's right here. All right. So I gotta look at the agenda so we can do this. All right, that brings us to item number 2, the annual review of the investment policy. Do we have a staff report on this?
Yes, the city's required under California Government Code, and City Council is to adopt an investment policy. The policy itself has to be in compliance with state law as well, which limits what can be invested in. Our policy's been in place and with slight amendments each year to gain again compliance with changes to state law since the city was incorporated. This year's policy is basically last year's policy. The auditors went through and made a couple of edits for compliance with state law, and they also made a recommendation, and I'm gonna take a step back really quick and talk about the city's investment practices that date back to 1994 with one slight modification 2 years ago, which has been, and 1994 was a bellwether moment, if you will, when the county declared bankruptcy. The city had some monies invested with the county pool. The city lost some money. They did make some changes. You won't see the county pool as an option in here. But they did dumb down our portfolio significantly as far as what we invest in. So the city's practices for the past 25 years have been to target roughly half of the portfolio in U.S. Treasury notes and the other half in the state's local agency investment fund. And we've maintained that practice up to a couple years ago. The practice had been that it was the Treasury note portion of the portfolio was in 2-year Treasury notes with one maturing about every 4 months. So they'd have 1/5 of 1/2 of the portfolio, or 10% of the portfolio, in a 2-year T-note for 2 years, and they'd roll those. A couple of years ago, one of the members of the Financial Review Committee that it was in the finance industry recommended that we stagger that portion of the portfolio into a 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5-year T-note with one maturing each year. And we actually picked up some yield at that point when we did it. It's worked well. So that's our investment practice right now. We target about half our portfolio for the local agency investment fund that the state runs. It's overnight money, so we can literally just put in a request to pull money out of it. And then we've got the T-notes that are, again, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5-year. Very comfortable with that practice. We don't have investment staff in place, so having a simplified portfolio that really meets the main target of the policy, which is protecting the investments themselves, the city's money, not losing money. The primary objective here is not to see huge returns on the money. There is a target of achieving, through our practices, meeting a 3-month T-note return. It easily does that between life and the T-notes that we do have. And absent contracting for investment services to try and push our returns up, I'm very comfortable with our practices that we have here. So I think we're earning 2.5% on the local agency investment fund portion. A change in here was that the prior policies have always limited or targeted 50% in life. The treasurer recommended, and I totally support, but particularly in a rising interest rate environment, the ability for us to allow more money to stay in the local agency investment fund, so that the city treasurer who buy municipal buildings, the city manager doesn't have to give us approval to exceed the 50% limit. It's a very safe investment, again, overnight money, and it's bettering the returns that are targeted in the investment policy itself. So again, I did get one question regarding why do we have all the allowed investments in here if we're not using them? And we do have a little over $5 million placed out with a fiscal agent for the Community Facilities District, Headlands Community Facility District bonds, a reserve account. And they do have a money market account that takes advantage of the different options that we have in our policy. Now, technically, we don't have to have it in our policy because we do have a fiscal agent agreement that allows those things, but it's very common to sync the two up if we ever have an issue with the fiscal agent and we need to pull the money back in. It's just gonna make it easier instead of us having to run. And again, our practice, we won't change our practice without running it through the Financial Review Committee like we did the last time. Stick to the T-notes and the LAIF approach, absent contracting for professional investment services. So, do you have anything else to add? So we're looking for the Financial Review Committee, under its charter as established by the City Council, asked the Financial Review Committee to chime in on the policy, and then we would take it back to the council for actual adoption.
I have a question about the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 year. Now, when those come up for renewal, one will go up in 1 year or
Right.
something. Now, what length of
5 year. Well,
should
the 1 year that'll
So
be
they
the
all
first
go
one
to 5
maturing.
years?
No, well, they all will ratchet down. So we're only gonna roll one of them. The one that matures will
first
will roll out to a 5.
5, and then
And it's-
and the second year, the other one
Yes.
will
Five.
for
Yeah,
5.
it
Okay,
just
that's
keeps-
why I wondered what length of 1 year
And
we're
then
going
we
to roll
work
from,
to
so they
re-
all be equal.
And then we work to rebalance the entire portfolio. But it's harder to do now with not having everything maturing at the same
Yeah,
time.
right,
or
exactly.
every 4
Yeah,
months.
right.
So having some more ability to allow more in life helps that as well, which really is what.
And generally, what's your return on them versus the
It all depends.
Local.
It's gonna be better than the LAIF return, because LAIF is so short term.
yeah?
But we've picked up where we at now.
2.5.
Wait, 'cause interest rates been going up.
Yeah, we're north of 2.5 now on the next one, so.
I endorse going out further on the yield curve to go out to 5 years instead of like 2 year. You pick up a couple extra basis
Yeah,
points,
right.
and that's.
Well, you're going to
fine.
have 20% of that coming back every year now,
Yeah,
once you start to roll over, right? So you have
So what-
you have the 50% that's available at any time, and and then you'll never more than 1 year away from having another 20% coming available.
So this year when it comes up, was that a 5-year note? So they're all 5-year notes now and they're just staggered that way?
Yes.
Okay, all right. When did we do that?
I think it was 2017, might have been 16, it was a couple of years ago.
Okay.
Probably close to 16.
So it seems like your ability to get at the money is reasonable, even with 5-year notes, because you, like you said, you have 50% of it always available, and another 20% can't be more than a year away at the very max. If you did it the day, if you rolled it over the day before you needed it, right?
And, you know, Mark and I have talked a couple times. When I first got here, my previous job was CFO of the city of Long Beach, and I had a full-time city treasurer with staff that did do some of the different investments. And when I came in here, I thought, hey, we can pick up quite a bit of extra yield if we had this professionally managed. And I had a company that does that work come in and look at our portfolio and produce a report. And the then FRC, this would have been 2008, basically says, no, we're comfortable, just protect our principal and get a decent return, but we don't need to push the envelope here at all. And that company actually is a contractor for the city of LA as well. They do a lot of big portfolio management. And I know some of the joint powers authorities that we're involved in also contract out for services with professional money managers, and we could do it. You'll pick up some, whether it's really worth it in the end. I think it's more of a policy decision on.
Well, how much are you talking about that we could pick up? I mean, you're gonna offset the fees that we're gonna be charged.
It'll more than pay for the fees, but I'm just not sure. It's gonna put some more load on us as well, for managing a manager.
Mhm.
And right now, you literally want, we
You
manage
guys
our
aren't doing
cash flow,
anything right
but
now
it's,
anyway.
yeah.
Can your most conservative nonprofit foundation is earning what right now?
In that, there's probably like an 80% fixed income, maybe 20% equity, and it's gonna be getting 3.25, maybe mixed return. So again, not being all too familiar with the municipality investment style, as long as we can kind of either keep or maybe beat inflation by 10 or 15, 20 basis points, I think that's a home run, because conservation of principle is king, right? And that's seems really clear. The only thing I've spoken to our chief investment officer, and his comment was, commercial paper and repo paper and banker acceptance, those things they work fine when times are great,
And you gotta manage them.
and you got to manage them. But times get a little bit shaky. In 2008, shall we say, things tend to clog up. And so, if we want to just kind of keep it simple, if we really don't use these all that often, except for maybe that situation, maybe it's better. I don't want to say to dumb down, but just to simplify the investment policy statement. To just take them out. If we want to deal with the state investment agency and treasuries, that's a very defensible position, and you don't need to have more stuff out there that could tangle you up if people are saying, well, why didn't you do this, or why didn't you do that? If it's not part of, we can just kind of narrow down the breadth of what we're
So
looking at.
the commercial paper and bankers acceptances are things that the fiscal agent for the bond reserve account do use. They're in that money market account. Those are all investments in that account.
And so, I mean, I understand what both you're saying, but, earlier you said because of the bond account that and the money manager, we have that in ours in case we were to roll that back, take the money back, right? So we could just roll it back in and not have to change this policy.
Yeah.
So, and I understand what Ken's saying, that if you take it out of the policy, then it's gone and people can't even look at it. Why do you even have it in there? Are you using it? It's just not available to you. So
This is a very common policy, and I'll say
because we're not using it personally.
most of the smaller agencies would have the same policy.
Right.
Basically, this is what state law allows. Now, your practices are gonna be likely different.
Yeah, Fire Authority, this is all we do too. It's all T-bills and LAIF.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we could do, I mean, Mike makes a good point, that the CFD money is kind of a separate
Right.
thing, although it's covered under this. We could take some time over the next year with the FRC and look at some different investment policies from different agencies and figure out kind of what best practices and use those as templates to continue to improve as we go forward.
I mean, this, realistically, this is fine. I think you're really
Right.
starting to kind of pick around at the edges, because the difference between the return on a T-bill, your T-bill versus a banker acceptance note is not gonna be real significant. So you're really starting to kind of count pennies. a little bit, but just if you wanted to make it clean and easy, it would be easier just to kind of.
No, I mean, I understand what you're
Keep
saying.
it simple.
And I agree with that, because that's how we're doing it now anyway, right? Just T-bill and late, that's all we're doing, except for the bond fund.
Yeah.
And the only reason that's in here is because of the bond fund, in case we roll it back, so
Well, LAIF is also.
maybe
gonna have
I'm misunderstanding what
some of
Ken's
those
saying, I mean, right? I mean, you're saying take that out of the investment
I think
policy?
they get it on the investment if we don't use it, but again, I'm not privy to what has happened before and money coming in and
Right.
coming back out. So if you want to keep it in, just for that, that's fine, or maybe have some type of qualification language saying our primary
Practice.
focus will be, our primary
Right.
practice will be this, and we'll deviate only based upon recommendations by outside investment advisory firms telling us to do otherwise,
Right, okay.
maybe.
I'm looking for a place to put that.
My only other comment that I saw in here is, how much are you folks being charged for custody?
Like almost nothing,
Okay, good, less than 10 bits, that's less than 10 bits, like 5, 6, 7 bits.
just above one.
Perfect.
So we
Good deal.
don't even wanna ask.
Yeah, they might jack it up on you a little bit. Perfect.
B of A's our custody.
Okay, good.
I don't even think they realize they're not charging us much, so. It's on
Keep it
auto-
quiet.
Autopilot.
Okay, so
So
what
maybe Mike can
we
work
wanna
on
add,
some
maybe
language.
add that language, bring it back, and,
Well,
Why don't we
let's,
just add it?
you wanna add it right now?
Yeah, so
Okay.
what I'll add is language probably in the return on investment or yield. I will put it in as a lead-in to the types of, prior to types of authorized.
What page are you on?
Investments, so it'll be on the bottom of 8. You have the same page, Mike?
on the authorized investments.
Yeah.
Well, it starts in, yeah.
So where it gets into authorized investments
Right.
and it talks about the prudent investor rule,
Mhm.
I will follow that with a statement that the city's standing practices to target its investments in a T-note portfolio and local agency investment fund. Any changes from that practice would be brought back to the financial review committee. And with that,
You okay with that, Paul?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anything else on this item? No? We didn't need motions or anything to do that, right?
just make it part of the motion to recommend approval to the council.
Yeah, so there's some other red lines in this
Yeah, they,
document from made, that basically, the ones that on section 7, right, where the local agency investment fund.
yeah, so that one would allow more investment into the,
Right.
instead of limiting it to 50%.
Right.
It would put it all in the local agency investment fund if we wanted to.
Yeah.
Right,
And again, that's overnight money.
Yeah.
right.
We wouldn't
Well,
do
and
that.
and
We wouldn't
because
do
you're
that.
float on your T-bills, and when you turn
Yeah.
over is such that holding it right at 50% doesn't actually work very well, so.
It's almost impossible
Yeah.
to
Right.
hit that target.
Okay. So we need a motion to approve with the changes and move it on to the, how do you want to make the motion? Just,
To make a recommendation to the city council to approve.
yeah, recommend it to the city council with the changes that we discussed.
Whose motion?
I'll make the motion.
Second?
I'll second.
Any opposition? No? Good, passes. We're on to item 3. The review of the general fund reserve policy.
Mark, you wanna kick this off? or-
Yes, sorry. There's a little excitement going on down in Monarch Beach right now, so.
What? That's supposed to help me.
So we have been working through this budget process on our reserve policy. And we had developed a comprehensive set of financial policies working with the Government Finance Officers Association, I'll slow down, GFOA. So we now have an operating budget policy, we have a facilities maintenance policy, capital investment policy. The remaining policy that the council has not yet adopted is a reserves policy. The council has reviewed it a couple of times. It is based on GFOA's recommendations of best practice across the country, that they generally like to see at least 25% of an agency's funds in reserves. This policy has 27% broken down into certain reserves. And then more importantly for us is it has the ability to actually use the reserves. Historically, our reserves have been kind of locked up, and they were the third rail of politics. You never touched them because, that was problematic.
And they kept growing every year.
They kept growing every year. So the current policy as it's presented before you today has extensive use of reserves policy and replenishment requirements if they are reserved or if they are used. And then as there was some back and forth about, we don't currently have a policy on our unassigned fund balance, which is just a fund balance we carry at the end of every year. It's just a bucket of cash, if you will. So now there's a policy. Originally, recommendation was keep it at 7% of revenue. There was a council discussion about bumping it up to 10% of revenue, and the council came back and said maybe it's better at 7% of revenue, but let's look at utilizing the difference between that 7 and 10% for future capital investment. So we've also included in here what we're calling a community investment account policy that says, in addition to reserving for emergencies, let's start saving for the future. And so we'll do that in two ways. At the beginning of the year, you take 3% of your revenue growth and just direct that over into this community development account, community investment account. And at the end of the year, you'll sweep all of your operating budget surpluses. So you come in at the end of the year and you didn't spend everything you expected to, or you got more revenue than you expected to. And all of that would move over as well to fund your community investment account. And so, last thing I'll say is, by changing the amount of reserves and putting an amount on our unassigned fund balance, there will be some remaining unassigned fund balance above the amount dictated in the reserve. The council has directed that we take $5 million of that overage and set it aside to possibly go into a 115 trust, which is for the use of paying down unfunded pension liability. So there's a section in the tax code that allows agencies to move money into a trust tax-free to then earn investment income that can go to pay down unfunded pension liability. So that's the policy in front of you today.
The issue with the trust, once it goes in, it stays in. It can only be used for that.
Yeah.
I really endorse that. It was
Yeah.
maybe a month or two ago, I think, in the Orange County Business Journal. I'm not sure if it was Jody or somebody else from Chapman, had listed all the various cities and their unfunded pension liabilities. And if you want to have a connection with the citizenry out there and what is government doing for me, and you want to try and build your brand with the voters out there and say, because everyone knows it's a problem
Right.
all over the country and here in California as well, and actually get it in some of the papers and things of that sort. They're actually taking some proactive steps, unlike a lot of other municipalities that I know that are just kind of ducking and jiving, putting their head in the sand. I think that is great, and that people should get kudos for doing that, to actually tackling it and not just looking the other way right now. So that's really, really good. And people don't know about that. When they think about government, it's I got a parking ticket from somebody, or something else happened, or they're raising my taxes, or the sales tax is going up. That's something that you should really tout out there. That's neat. That's good. I feel good just hearing that. I'm pretty excited about that. I think that's great.
Well, the interesting thing about it, though, is when I got elected in 2014, we had zero unfunded pension liability. They've paid it down right before I got elected to zero. And then with PERS and missing their
benchmarks.
Their benchmarks, and now reducing their assumptions and changing the mortality tables, it just keeps growing and growing and growing. almost exponentially.
Ours is almost entirely from changes in actual
Right.
assumptions.
Yeah.
And more to come
And it's,
probably.
I think they're gonna
Okay.
drop it about another half a point, right?
I would be
Hers.
surprised right now. And we're still factoring in their first reductions down to 7 from 7.5.
Yeah.
But we'll see.
Well, and it's a quarter point. I heard they're going to 6.75.
Not yet.
Okay.
We're going to 7 from 7.5.
Yeah. So, we're gonna do that.
Well,
I think-
we need to
I
go
think.
through.
Yeah, he's gonna go through.
We need to find the 5 million first. That's the hard part. And that's the.
Did you have anything else you wanted to add, Mike?
No. Just on the section 115 trust, we're waiting for CalPERS. They got state legislation last year that allows them to set up a 115
Mhm.
trust. And
That's
so-
right.
So we're waiting for them to finish that. There should be,
They
they've
tr-
got it set up, they haven't executed it yet though, because they want to get a couple big players like Metropolitan
Right.
Water and others
Right.
to come in with sufficient cash that it, will carry the load, if you will. So we may be one of the first ins, but we'll be following some of the bigger contributions into the trust.
Is CalPERS gonna be managing the 115
Yeah.
trust?
But
Yeah.
the way the
The
one
rules are different.
Yeah, the rules are different. So
Because I don't understand why we would give money to somebody who
Right.
screwed it up to
That's-
begin with.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
a part of
That's
the.
Which is why we wouldn't just give it to CalPERS.
Yeah.
So CalPERS has an investment strategy right now that's trying to hit those numbers long-term. They're 7.25 going down to 7. What the trust will do is it will, not unlike our investment policy, it will limit what they're allowed to put money into for those trust investments. So we'd be targeting, they're gonna give options. They might come out of the gate with one option of 5% would be their target as opposed to the 7.
Right.
But they will probably be coming out with additional options of 4 and 6 even. At some point, I expect them to come out with one that we would probably look to match off against some private sector ones in a request for proposals process.
Exactly.
But they're
Who else did we look at on this? There's a couple
Pars.
other.
Yeah, so
Pars
PARS,
and
Keenan,
Keenan.
and
PFM.
all offer it. So part of why we want to wait for PERS is let's compare all three
Right.
or all four of them against each other, because it is rumored that PERS will charge a whole lot less
Yeah.
for.
They're
That's what I was gonna
charging.
say, that's why we were
Yeah, they're
looking at
charging
this one.
10 basis points right now. They've got one for other post-employment benefits liabilities. This would be like post-retirement healthcare that we don't have.
Right.
But, so they've already got their mechanism set up, and now the 115 is specifically for pensions, not other
Right.
than pensions.
Right.
And they're charging 10 basis points, and it's essentially gonna, they're utilizing their same investment team
Mhm.
with a different
Different set of
mix.
rules, right.
So we're leveraging that. I would expect it to be in the 10 to 15% range, or 10 to 15 basis point range, versus I think the numbers we got from the private sector were 40 to 50. So it's definitely cheaper, and if you're getting the same asset
So-
investment mix, then
So what if we ended up setting this up and going with PERS, and we're seeing that the other managers are doing better?
move it.
You can move it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
And the intent here also is that this money would actually be, if we make a contribution to the 115, whoever's managing it, it would sit there for 5 or 6 years
Mhm.
and earn interest. And then we would start pulling portion off of our growing unfunded liability payment. And right now, our unfunded liability payment is $250,000 this year, going to $280,000. And then it's, by 2026, it's at $750,000.
Right.
And we'd be looking to then start carving off some of the money in the 115 trust to flatten that line out, make it predictable. Probably, our numbers right now, if we,
Mhm.
based on our actuarial work that we did a couple months ago, would be, if we let it sit there and it earn interest at 5%, and then we start pulling it off at 2026, it would drop our annual payment to the $400,000 range, so we'd still be making a city contribution for it. I think that's important that we keep doing that. But it flattens it out there until it's paid off in 2040 or whatever it is.
And the total liability is,
Right now it's 5.
Five.
It will probably be going to 6, or somewhere near that when we get our next study. But it's factored into all of our
And the
projections.
good thing is if we do hit a financial downturn and our revenues go down, we can actually use that money to make our payment. So we wouldn't have to come.
It's eligible for any,
As long as it goes to any
pension
pension, but
contribution.
that's one of the benefits of it, if in case you do have something or a catastrophic event where you just don't have the cash to make your PERS payment, you can actually take it out of the trust that year.
You can essentially do 2 years, the last
Right.
year and the current year.
Right.
And then
So
have to
you
wait
can
a
only
year.
pay your premium essentially for 2 years.
You can reimburse yourself essentially at the end of the year, and then the next day prepay the next year.
So that trust really acts as an additional reserve beyond the 3 that are identified
Right.
here, because it does have the ability to be used in cases of, economic distress.
where would you take the $5 million from?
Current
Unassigned
unassigned fund balance,
fund
yeah.
balance.
One-time money for a one-time purpose is kind of our motto now.
And that balance right now is like 7.5 million?
We've got it up at 9 right now.
So I think you have to go through the entire reserve process before you can answer that question of where that money comes from, right?
It's there right now.
So, yeah.
I'll stick with my statement.
Okay.
The other thing I think that the reserve.
So I wanna understand what he just said.
Yeah, I don't get that either.
Are you saying that when we go through the reserve process, that money may not be 9 million?
Well,
You're saying you're gonna take out of our unassigned fund balance, and that's gonna start filling some of our other reserves?
well, there's a whole set of changes to the reserve
Right.
proposed here,
Right.
right? And technically, whether the reserves or not is one bit of the discussion, but there's a whole set of how the money in accounts needs to have balances and what those numbers are and a variety of things. So, for example, if we decide that the unassigned fund balance must remain at 10%, right, minimum, that's the floor of it, then you have to look at, then your cash, all of your cash transactions that, to essentially even out your uneven revenue have to come above that 10% floor, if it's the floor, right? Unless you have a reason to drop the floor, right? And so, again, that's a question about how that money gets used in the unassigned fund balance.
But the unassigned fund balance currently is not used for cash flow.
Right. But we have a cash flow, we have a cash flow reserve now.
And there's no
that we're-
policy for the use of unassigned fund balance currently.
Right.
It can be with 3 votes next Tuesday, spent on
So
anything.
maybe it'll
Well,
help
that's
if I talk.
any reserve, we set up 3 votes and you can spend it on anything.
But you have to adjust the policy first,
Right.
right? So,
Maybe it'll help if I talk about our new reserve policy and how it's been in place for 15 years. So a quick synopsis on that. 20% of general fund annual revenue is set aside in emergency reserve. That's never been touched. 10% is in a cash flow reserve intended for swings in cash flow where we get property tax payments essentially twice a year, December and April, but we paying bills all year long. We don't get our sales tax evenly throughout the year. Our franchise fees come in on the latter half of the year. So there's cash flow.
But that's also what the LAIF account is for. If you're getting close, you could pull it.
This is more of an accounting versus the
Right.
liquidity of your cash. So,
Yeah, gotcha. All right.
and then there's a $2.5 million capital improvement account set aside that's never had a real purpose. It was never. It wasn't written correctly, and I mean, it's something I inherited. They adopted these policies the year before I got here, and as soon as I saw it, I was like, that's never gonna get touched. It's just money sitting there.
Aren't
So-
there 3 sections though?
That's the third one, is the capital So you've got emergency, cash flow, and
There's
capital.
4
4, yeah, where's one, there's one miss.
in the current policy.
Yeah, there's 3.
3.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, there's 3, yes.
We also have an art in public places that's
Yeah,
noise,
sure.
but it's
You're
restricted
wrong,
monies.
yeah, right, sorry.
And then you've got unassigned fund balance. So in reality, our cash flow, and I actually just had Robin pull down our cash book. We went back 3 years. Our biggest day upside down was $500,000. We're carrying $3.8 million right now in our cash flow reserve. It's 10%, set at 10% of revenues. I've said since day one, you don't need that. It's just money sitting there. Now, it collects interest on your investments, and yes, it does contribute to the annual cash flow, but it's money that's never gonna be used for what its intended purpose was. My best guess is it was an arbitrary percentage that was established at the time, because there's nothing to back it up that I could see that we'd ever be that much upside down on any given day. The other thing that you don't see in our cash flows is we're not like a lot of corporations that are gonna hold their payments until the last day that they're due so that they can earn interest on them. As we get the bills in, we're paying them. So we're always caught up. We've always got the flexibility for a couple of weeks to sit on checks if we ever had a cash flow problem, which we're not gonna have. So the whole idea of having the cash flow reserve, it's not I don't wanna say it's widely used to have a cash flow reserve. They are out there. I didn't even have one with the city of Long Beach, so it's obviously a lot bigger. So now moving to our new reserves, and I'll start with the unassigned fund balance, which should be used for the cash flow reserve, and that's why it's been established with the 4% floor, which is pretty much triple what we would ever need at 4% to have a floor on it. And then the 7% now recommended ceiling is really opportunity money if you need it for something. It's also a buffer before you have to get into the economic stability reserve, which is there designed to take into account any changes in your typical income. Our real volatile one would be hotel taxes, and then the emergency reserve. And right now, the emergency reserve at 20% is crazy. We've got $1 insurance. We're in a government pool who has their own self-insured retentions and excess policies above that cover us up to $50 million. And it covers everything except, and I'm gonna use this because it's just the most direct, stupid decisions. They're not gonna cover us taking an illegal taking of private property and we get sued and end up having to buy the property and pay attorney's fees. They're not gonna cover those things, but any claims against us, they're covered $1. Not only that, but they also manage the litigation for us, and all those costs are included in the insurance pool. But
When I'm thinking about the reserves, what are the, and I was gonna ask a question about the insurance as well, like for acts of God and these black swan events. So I'm kind of learning that we get our revenues from property taxes, bed occupancy taxes, and from sales tax. So looking at black swan events out there, I mean, life's pretty, at least the economy is good, their side of the political equation you're on. People are employed and companies are making money. In 2022, the Great Recession of 2022, followed by the Great Earthquake of 2023, that knocks out all the hotels that are going up and knocks out our occupancy taxes because there are no beds to rent out down there, and people aren't buying stuff because something happened. That's the concern of the emergency information, economic stability. But for like acts of God, like if a bridge is falling down or the staircases came down, we have
we have both.
it's $1 with no deductible?
Correct.
Because that's
our
that's our
property
reserve, we're paying a premium
on our
for that.
property insurance, because we have separate property insurance from, governments get sued for everything. It's amazing.
Yeah, slip and
what-
fall, sure.
Yeah.
Not just slip and falls, even people that have a slip and fall in the harbor that we don't own, we get named in the lawsuits, in the claims. But we've got property insurance on everything we own, for everything except for vehicle accidents are $1,000 deductible, and All the rest of it's 5,000 per occurrence.
So we have comprehensive liability.
Yes.
And then we also have property insurance. So when we're insuring for acts of God or reserving
This
for
is more, it's more
emergencies.
cash flow.
Okay.
Because we have to respond immediately. We've got bills now, and it might take the insurance company, like for instance.
6 months or a year to start rebuilding something.
Or some amount of time, so it's more cash flow basis. Even if City Hall were to fall down and wipe out all of our IT stuff, our insurance company has a disaster recovery policy that they bring in the double wides with all the IT phone systems and everything. We'll get all those things, so we are covered even for disaster recovery to have our own operations.
But there's transition money that's necessary.
Yeah.
Okay. I think just the big picture, reserves, it's always easy to explain away a positive variance report in a reserve money that's not being used, as opposed to having to explain away why, having explain it to a board of directors or a city council, why we don't have enough money to pay for expenses that in hindsight we should have known might have been coming down the pipe. So,
And we also have another reserve in our budget, and that's the level of service that we provide. That there's a lot of places in our operations that we could dial back, and you might have to when something bad happens. So we can adjust operationally as well to help out on cash flow.
has that ever been quantified in terms of you can have one less
So-
assistant here, or?
For,
It's not just bodies either, there's contracts, level of service.
yeah, we will get you guys a copy of the proposed budget for this year, because going forward as a part of the FRC process, we'll want to get together quarterly and review the quarterly results. And I think as a part of one of those future meetings, we're probably gonna wanna come in and talk about the 115 trust before we go
Yeah.
to council on it.
Absolutely.
But one of the things the council directed this year for the budget was to go through a bit of priority-based budgeting, and so they wanted to understand all of the expenditures across the operating budget in terms of categories of expense: core expense, important expense, and value-added expense, right? Core are those things that we're mandated to do. Important are those things that are by definition important, you know, can protect us against liability, that sort of thing. Value-added are value-added. So for example, our entire recreation budget is considered value-added. In our budget, the initial cut at it showed that 86% of the budget was core, and the remaining 14 was important and value-added. Council's made some tweaks to that, but that's the rough order of magnitude of where we're at. But as Mike also says, is in addition to that 14% of important and value-added stuff, within the core, there's some level of service there that people in Dana Point have come to expect, right? They want their plans turned around on a quick basis. They want their parks looking a certain way. They want their facilities looking a certain way. They want to have, well, the fireworks is part of the recreation value-added stuff, but there's some of that level of service that could be reduced or diminished, you know, in cases of very extreme events, that is also a reserve, if you will. You know, our sheriff's contract is, we have approximately 5 million visitors a year, so we have a larger sheriff's contract than our friends in San Juan Capistrano, for example, although our population's roughly the same size. They don't have a harbor, they don't have a state beach, they don't have county
Our sheriff's
beaches.
contract is just a little less than Laguna de Gales, is almost twice our population.
So we also, the council invests in a whole community service unit of deputies that aren't tied to responding to 911 calls. They're out there proactively working in the community. That's where our homeless liaison officer is located. That's, you know, all of the sort of quality of life issues that we deal with. Those folks are dedicated primarily to those things. So those are things that are certainly very nice to have and people in town come to expect, given for what they pay for property here. But in a very worst case scenario, those are areas where you can look at to address cash flow issues.
But we're not having cash flow issues. I mean, we have a lot of money sitting there. I don't understand the cash flow issue. We have fully funded maintenance and building and facility funds, and we have the $9 million in the unassigned fund balance. So I don't see what the issue is.
Well, I don't think it's quite that simple, unfortunately. I mean, I'm not saying we're having cash flow issues at the moment, right? But we've been also for 10 years of a good economic run, and so fortunately during that period of time, we're now in the process with this new budget, sort of catching up on deferred maintenance and putting in and suggesting that money be put away to catch up on our unfunded pension liability that wasn't dealt with during all that time when it started to show up, and so our parks, our maintenance, our buildings are getting repaired, and we're getting back to where our overall maintenance costs are routine maintenance opposed to deferred maintenance and catch up, right? So they should flatten out a bit. But our economic forecast says that our operating expenses and our projected revenue are assuming everything continues the way it is, are right on top of one another. So essentially, that we have no ability to accrue additional money into an investment account to build a new facility, to replace something that's not being reserved for. So right now, as long as the economy stayed steady and we could manage the sheriff contract a bit, we could manage to take the money in one side and pay it out the other, and everything would work, right? But if you get an economic downturn, we're going to have a cash flow issue. We're going to have to adjust, right? And it takes time to adjust. Right? So the reserve accounts are there to allow us to take the time to adjust until we can. I mean, even when they're talking about cutting services and potentially staff, if it would be to adjust, it still takes time. There's not an instant drop in outlay. So as you start to work through contracts that are in place that have to be finished through, how long it takes to ramp down stuff, they all take a little bit of time, right? So you need to have something that allows you to spend more than you're bringing in and slowly ratchet down your expenses until it's in line with your revenue. So you need some reserve to do that, right?
There's not a lot of our contracts that need a lot of lead time to make changes to them, though. So.
Yeah.
They're all 30 days.
No.
I agree. I just agree with Paul. I agree. It doesn't appear, with my limited knowledge, that we have a cash flow problem right now. But if I just analogize to real estate developers putting together a project and they have a little pro forma, and they assume the building's going to be 90% leased. And if it's 90% leased, everything's great. If it's 93% leased, life is even better. When it goes down to 67% because you lost a big tenant or the economy starts to trickle down, that's when you start having real problems. And nobody ever likes to think it's psychologically unsettling to think that things might not be so great in 2021 and 2023 and 2025. And I just think right now when things are good, to stuff more money away in the rainy day fund, even though we have a lot in there, you can never have enough extra money when things get kind of ugly out there. And so I think having our reserve accounts and keeping those flush with cash is a prudent thing to do, because life is uncertain and things can change, and we don't want to be pointing fingers and what happened here. And the last thing you want to do is start letting people go or cutting back on
So
services.
when the Great Recession hit, and
When the next one will hit.
when the president went on TV and said, those bad banks and finance institutions that are too big to fail are having a conference at the St. Regis, and everybody in those industries, insurance, banking, immediately called and canceled all their scheduled stuff, and our revenues went down 40% from our largest revenue source even with all that, with our turning dials, we never touched our reserves. So we've got, this is a big machine with a lot of options, before you get to ones that are painful, and we didn't hear painful ones.
Well, one thing that we,
But we actually want to build these so that we actually use them.
well, and that's where I was getting to. So we've developed these reserve policies now to make them functional, right? Because they didn't get used in the worst case scenario. And so the question I've been thinking about, and this is more for Mike, is, you know, if you look at conditions for use of reserves on page 7 under A, use of reserves in the second paragraph, it says if necessary, the city should only use up to 50% of either designated reserve to continue operations. So that's a fairly recent addition as we've kind of gone through the iterations of this policy. But Mike, it seems to me that maybe if we're going to have something that says we can use up to 50%, does that eliminate the need to have a range? Because if you look back on page 5, amounts held in reserve, we've got 7 to 11% annual operating, 6 to 9 or economic stability, 6 to 9 extreme event, and then the 7%, 4 to 7 in the unassigned fund balance. So the idea originally with the ranges was to have flexibility to use them, but we've now sort of double built in flexibility by saying you can use up to 50%. So does that address that issue?
Yeah, it's covered in there. The lower end of the range was literally intended as a psychological barrier in using reserves. Kind of a line in the sand. You don't want to use them all. It's not needed. And it was a concept that Shane Kavanaugh, the gentleman from GFOA that assisted us in this project, him and I had a lot of discussions about reserves never being touchable, and how do you build it so that when somebody's having a discussion that you're, even though you use them, you're still within policy. And it was, if you had a floor, you're still better than the floor, I guess. So it was more of a psychological, I mean, he was pretty adamant about finding a way to have a mindset for the body politic to not be afraid to use the reserves, that it's okay to use them. That's what they're for. And he's seen it across the country in assisting government agencies with doing financial policies, that it literally is the third rail. You can't touch your reserves. It becomes a campaign issue immediately. And you know, how do you break that? That you're a business and you should have reserves, and if something bad happens, you should be able to use them. So
Well,
that was why it was put in there. And is it needed? No.
Well, now that we've got the 50%.
we have a couple of possibilities, but I want to respond. So I agree when, your comment that we didn't use the reserves, the end result of that was, was what we're catching up on now, was all the deferred maintenance and other things that weren't done during that time because we actually couldn't afford the maintenance of our buildings and our parks and et cetera. So we've now been throwing a couple of $1 million a year into the maintenance to do catch up, right? So that's ultimately how we would have been better off, in my view, to use the reserves to cover some of that and then pay it back than we would to defer it and try to catch up. That's why.
There was more to it than we're not going to do. It was never a discussion. We're not going to do those things in order to survive the recession. There was a lot more to it, and it was more personality driven than anything, because we've always done all that work except for the facilities work, which we've got $4 million, literally over. You're talking about 12 years now, or 11 years since the Great Recession. We had $4 million of deferred maintenance over that period. So that wasn't what balanced this whole thing.
It wasn't, but
it was-
in fact, we did we did defer maintenance and we're having to play catch up now,
Yes,
right?
yes.
So, for sure.
And
So in
We're
terms
not
of,
having to cut anything in order to
But
do
I
that.
think the point is, we didn't defer maintenance because we didn't want to touch our reserves. Is that what I'm hearing?
that's what the point I
That-
was making, right?
but no,
We didn't want to touch them, so we.
No, that's not
Oh, that
why
wasn't why we did.
That's not
Well,
why it happened.
okay.
It was,
Well-
that was a conscious decision not to do it,
Right.
and you were here for why that decision was made.
Yeah.
But it wasn't because we didn't want to
Right.
dip into our reserves
Well-
to do it.
But anyway,
We could have replaced the air conditioners, but we put a monument sign on town center. It's a simple way to say it.
yeah.
Um,
Well,
We didn't replace vehicles, so.
so those are also part of just the
Park project.
political reality
Exactly.
of politicians, right? Which is why you want policy, right?
Yes, that's why we have the facilities policy, we have the capital.
But when we set out
That's the
to
policy.
look at, basically, right now, we said we really have reserves. We don't actually have a policy on how and when you would use them, and how, when you did use them, that you would replenish them. And that means we have money sitting there. Well, the policy says stick it away, but the policy never says and then what, right? So I agree with that part, right? I mean, I think we set out to do that, and I'm in agreement with that. In terms of getting there, though, the question is, so you can do that a variety of ways. The question really is, I mean, if I walk through where we started on that conversation about how to make our reserves work effectively for us, as opposed to simply being money set there that we say we have, we took the emergency reserve of 20% and we broke it into to two reserves: economic stability and extreme event reserve, right? And one's 11 and one's 9 if you fund them to their top at least, right? And by breaking them two, we could give much more precise usage of each one, right? This one gets used this way under these, and it gets replenished this way. So it gave us more definitive or more finite policy on how they got used and how they got replenished. But ultimately, if you set their top at their top of their range, they still make up the 20% that was setting in the initial reserve. So we haven't reduced our reserve, we simply redefined it, and we defined how to use it and how to replenish it. Coming back now to this thing about the range, there's two ways that we could deal with the fact the range of 50% that's in there now, as we discussed it, was set to say, and that's 50% in a single event. So an event occurs and you decide to pull reserves, and you can use up to half of what's in them, right? With the theory being that until you start to pay them back, there could be another event, and if you drove them to zero, you wouldn't be able to respond a second time, right? So we essentially covered it to say you get two events concurring before you get some payback, before you really have a problem, because and that's a reasonable risk, I think. You could equally use the bottom list to say the first event can drive them from 11% down to whatever we set the bottom. Is it 7? Or, yeah. And it can't drive it below that, and before that, the second event can then drive it below that to some other number. So you could use the range to where you can drive it with a single event versus 50%. But the idea of declaring it to be a range and a 50% sort of make it
Yeah.
somewhat difficult to
The range-
understand.
Yeah, the range wasn't part of the original discussion, it was one of the iterations from all the input to try
Yeah.
to get to some consensus. But it wasn't part of the original recommendation from GFY.
But as I read it, the way it was written, the actual reserve that you hold isn't to the max into that. It's to whatever point between min and max you decide to pick, right? So you could equally decide we will, let's say we transferred our 20% over to and we fully funded at 11 and 9. And then we decided we needed to we use a reserve, so we drew it down to 7. Okay. it allows you to simply, as doing that, simply reset the target to 7 and have no repayment plan. I mean, the policy as written allows that to happen, right? I don't like that. I mean, ultimately, that's my concern with the range, is if I drop from 11 down to 7, I want to have within 90 days, as we set out, a plan as to what time period and how we're going to begin to bring that back up so that if we need it again, it's there, as opposed to allowing us to reset the target and have no repayment plan.
So it's stated in the policy that it's a council priority to aim to fund at the top of the range.
Right.
City managers to come up with a plan, if we do use the reserve, to bring us back to the top of the range.
But if you need that, you don't need the range, then you simply always start driving off the top. You pull it down from
Yeah,
the top to a certain amount. and
There's
you
no
drive
hard line
it
on my
back.
part if the
Right.
minimum amount got removed, it really was a,
Because that creates, the minimum amount creates me lots of heartburn. I guess I'll put it that way.
And that's kind of what I was getting at, is since we've now changed it to address the 50%, why don't we just get rid of the minimums? It's, under this policy, I'm obligated to bring a budget that funds it to the maximum.
So you also have to change the policy then, just because our policy is to fund it at the max.
Yeah.
Well, if you take off the bottom part of the range, it's just a number now, you have to fund to that number.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is what we have to do anyways.
We don't have to, but that's what
Well,
Paul's
that's-
concern is.
But that's
I
the
mean,
number
but that's
I
what I'm saying,
want.
you have to change the language at that point and say you will fund at this level. And then, in
It's
an
already
emergency, you
got-
could draw it down to 50% and go back.
that's already in the language.
But it says our intent is to fund at the max, but it didn't say we have to.
So,
So my point is,
This-
if that's still there and I just put 11% and no minimum level, my intent's to get there, but it didn't say I have to get there. So I could actually drop down to 2% if I wanted to, without a lower range on it.
and it may take you 5 years to fully refund the reserve. We just need to make sure that there's some flexibility. The way it was recently drafted with changes from you, recommended from you a couple weeks ago, was if we use the reserves, city managers got up to 180 days to come back with a plan to reestablish the reserves. So this basically says we're supposed to do it within the 5-year time horizon of our long-term financial.
Yeah, I mean,
goals.
his plan says he has to come back within 90 days with a plan. Then it says that that plan should not exceed 5 years.
Right.
Basically, that's kind of the boundaries.
Which-
Within 5 years, it
Yep.
needs to get back
Which
up to where it
prudently
needs to
would be
be.
pushed out to 5 years, but again, you're talking about things we don't, trying to predict what might happen. And
Right. But the longer that time frame is, the higher your risk that you get a second event within the time that it hasn't been reestablished. So you always want to keep that to what you can afford to do. But nevertheless, 5 years is an okay target and a maximum time to replenish. But
But getting back to your range issue, you have to change the language. You can't just say our intent is to fund to this level, because it doesn't say have to fund to that level. And if you don't have a bottom end of that range, I could drop it down to 1% if I wanted to.
Well, you can
My
drop-
intent's to get there, but I'm not there. I'm
you
just
can
gonna
drop
leave
it down to
here.
1% now. It doesn't change that. It only changes your starting point, right? Right now, you
But
can
with
drop.
the lower end, you've got to stay 4.
No, it doesn't
Or,
say
or
that.
whatever the number is, 7 to 11 right now.
It
So
only
you
said
got to stay in that range.
that. It doesn't say that
And
in
that
the
range
policy.
is within policy.
Right.
If you go below that range, regardless, if your intent is to hit the top, policy is to be within range. If you fall below that, anywhere in there, because your intent is to hit the top, you have to have a plan to get back there, within the range.
Would-
But your intent's to go to the top.
Right.
So it's,
Because you
It's a lot of
basically
extra
have the
work
right
to-
to use up a given percent of it, so, and still be within what our policy allows. As long as you have a plan to replace it that's put out, right? So, and if the second event drives it to 2%,
Well,
and drive it to 2%.
And I get that.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about an event.
Yeah,
I'm talking about the actual policy itself. If you take the lower end off that range,
yeah,
and I come in as a new council member and say, you know what, it just says my intent's to get to 11%. It doesn't say I have to get there.
Right. Understood.
And if there's no bottom end on that,
Right.
I could drop it down to whatever I wanted to drop it down to and still be within policy, because, my intent's to get there, but it may take me 5,
right.
6,
So you're
however
saying
many
that the
years.
language should say, the
The language
policy
has to change.
establishes
If you're gonna take the range off of it, you have to say it will be funded at this,
You target,
unless there's an event.
the policy says you fund it at the max.
Right.
Right, at 11%. And anytime you drop it down, your plan has to be,
At the max, you can drop down to 50%.
the plan he has to bring tells us
Right.
how to get it back there,
Yeah,
right?
but you have to say you will fund it at this level.
Yeah,
It says it's a stated
That's
priority.
my, huh?
It's a stated priority to fund at the top.
Where were you reading it?
I am on page 2 of 3,
Page 2.
Page
page 6 and
Right.
Yeah, page 6 on the
Page 6.
the first paragraph,
Okay.
next to the last sentence.
There's also a stated council priority to aim to fund at the top of the
To
range.
aim, to fund at the top, to aim, it doesn't say have to. My point is, it doesn't say I have to fund there. And if you don't put a bottom number on that, I could come in and say, my aim's to get there, but I'm not going to, I'm just gonna get to 6% right now, and leave it there. Without
I don't have a
having,
problem with changing the language to make
like
sure
shall.
that it says we
shall
fund
fund
at
it,
the.
that's my point.
that's basically what
As
the
soon as
one
I read
says
it,
now.
but
You
taking
shall
the bottom
fund
end off of it, I'm like,
20%.
man, I can go anywhere I
And
want.
then
with
if
it.
you
Let's
use
just
it, you have
get
to-
rid of the words to aim.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I think
Yeah.
that's correct. I mean,
Council
we just want to say
priority
we're,
funded
we're
at the top
funding
of
it
the
to
range.
11%, and if you drop it down, you have to have a plan to get it back to
Right.
11%.
Yep.
Right.
That's
I
fine.
mean, basically is what it says, right? And the same with the second one of the 9%. I mean, they should say the same.
So-
They're.
Well, it applies
I sit
to
on
all.
too many
Yeah,
boards where they
all.
game that all the time, so.
Yeah.
Let's not do that.
So it's the staff's intention to do 11% for the stability reserve, 9% for the event reserve, and then 7% for the fund balance, unassigned fund balance?
Well, okay, so let's, yeah. anyway, so-
11% economic stability, 9% extreme event, and then 7% unassigned.
No. Now, if we follow through, then the next proposed part of this is to do away with the cash flow reserve.
It already is, it's not in the new policy.
It's, yeah.
That's what I said, so the policy changes that we're proposing, one was to divvy up the emergency fund reserve into these two funds. The second piece was to simply do away with the cash flow reserve, right, which is 10%.
No, because the unassigned fund balance becomes the cash flow reserve.
Well, but it does,
Because there is no policy on unassigned fund balance currently.
Right,
It's just a
but-
pot of money.
it's just a pot of money, right? But if you take, but that sets, again, that's funded at, the cash flow reserve is funded at 10%, right? If you do away with it, which this policy does, then you haven't yet established that, we haven't yet set any other place where you must reserve 10% of your, or any other
Do it in
percent,
the
right?
unassigned fund
the
balance
unassigned
policy
fund
at
balance.
7%, not 10%.
But that's not what that unassigned fund balance policy, if
That's
you will, says.
Absolutely what it says.
It's on,
Though
bottom of
designate-
that same page, or
Yes.
finally.
Finally.
Though not a designated reserve shall maintain an adequate amount of working capital on hand in order to ensure smooth operations through
That's your cash
normal
flow.
differences. That is the definition of cash flow.
Right,
Page 2 and 3.
right.
And then generally an amount equal to 4 to 7%, we're gonna drop the 4 off and
Yeah,
just make it
just make it
7.
7.
Okay, so what paragraph are you
It's
reading?
right here where it
This
says
is
finally.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay,
there's
right,
this paragraph
okay,
right
right, so
here.
I just, okay.
Yep.
So basically, alls it says is you have to maintain an adequate amount, and that's all it actually says. In the whole paragraph, it doesn't, I mean, it says that generally that should be between 4 and something, but it doesn't require you to do it. It has no minimum floor, right? It simply says generally you have to maintain an adequate amount of working
It's a
capital.
stated priority.
We can
to
tighten
fund
that
at the
language
top
up
of
to
the-
require that it be funded at 7%. I mean, that's the intent. So,
Right.
again,
If
we
you-
can use words like shall.
The required amount for the working capital is the floor on that one. That's the 4%. Between the 4 and the 7 or the 4 and the 10, whatever it is, that's opportunity money. That's literally just, so you've got some cash. So if you say it's gotta be 7, then you've created money that's not touchable.
Right.
Well, I'm not
You
saying
don't need- it's-
the
it's-
amount it
it's
should.
So
really-
this one should be 4%. And if anything we have over that, then we can create that buffer above it. We could go over our minimums, right? our
Well,
max
you
ones
could
are
do it a
around
couple ways. I mean, first of all, if you think 4%'s the money you need, not 10, right? Because it's right now the cash flow reserve's 10%, right? So you're going to do away with that 10% money, and if you say that you think 4 is the right amount to have on hand in an emergency situation, max, right? Then you should never drive your unassigned fund balance below 4, right? I mean, in case, and if you want to drive it below 4, there should be a policy on when and how you would do that. Just like any other reserve, right? It says if you need to drive it below 4, that's an exception, not the norm, right? And therefore the policy says you can drive it below 4 only if it's used these ways and it's replenished, right? And we don't have that in.
We don't have a
That
use
stated.
of unassigned fund balance in here because it exists primarily to service a cash flow. So nothing in this policy allows for using unassigned fund balance in cases of emergency or economic instability.
Right. But
Well, I'm gonna tell you right now that a council, if we come in and say, okay, we're gonna tap the economic uncertainty reserve, and in order to replenish that, we're gonna cut back on operations, one of the things they're gonna say is, why aren't we using that money there that is unassigned? It's just
well,
there.
I'm not saying you shouldn't use it. I'm just simply saying that ultimately what this policy says is we're going to do away with the 10% cash flow reserve, right? And we're not going to replace it with anything. That you'll just
No, we
use
are.
your.
This replaces it. It's
This
stated in
does-
here.
there's no
Stated in
reason-
here, it says working capital, that's cash flow.
But it simply says we'll just maintain adequate working cash flow. It doesn't
have
say
$9
what it
billion
is. It doesn't
sitting
set a
there doing
floor.
nothing.
It doesn't set.
Well, it says 4 to 7% right now. Or
Well,
4 to 10.
yeah.
We're recommending 7.
But it doesn't have any requirement for anything, right? It
Right,
says
it's unassigned.
generally I'm going to maintain adequate working, which is usually between
then
4 and
some
7%. That's all it
Just
says,
in
right?
case we want to do something, maybe.
Right? It doesn't.
It
It doesn't. So
literally decide
I mean,
you wanna do it.
ultimately, it totally wipes out the reserve, right? It says we're going to maintain. We're going to use our cash flow to fund our cash flow. We don't have any reserve for it. Whatever's in the balance is in the balance, and we'd like to have it between 4 and 7, but we're not required to in any way. There's nothing that restricts the use of that to drive it to 0 in this policy. Right.
Nothing allows the use of it.
Basically,
Nothing prevents us from driving
nothing
it down to
prevents
zero.
you to drive it to 0. It's,
It's
not out of
basically the same
policy.
thing I was
It's not
talking
out of the
about the
norm.
low end, it's basically getting at what I was saying with the language in there. In the last policy we had to say shall or take language out that we were gonna fund at our max. It's the same problem he has, it's language in here doesn't say we have to be at some number, we can't just drive to 0.
And if you're going to go below that number, you have to have you have to have a reason to go below it, and you have to have a way to fix it, right? Eventually, right?
So
right now, it
he's
simply
still
says,
he's creating a fund balance, a reserve.
Well,
4%, a 4% reserve that
Isn't
we
that
can't
what
touch.
this
Well,
is?
But Paul's
Unassigned
talking about
fund
creating
balance-
a 4% reserve that we can't touch without a reason.
unassigned fund balance is not a reserve. It's just a balance. It's just an account that you're spending your cash flow out
Let me
of,
make a
right?
recommendation that we create a hard floor of 4%. That is your working capital.
But there's no reason to create a hard floor of 4%. Any more than there is to have is simply to reduce the cash, the current reserve account number to 4%. That would have the same benefit, right? Which is, in other words, right now we have a 10% reserve. You could take it to 4% and say, that's my 4% but if it's a hard floor that doesn't have any description on how you would take advantage of that 4% setting there and how you would replenish it if you took advantage of it, then it's just whether it's setting in the base of the unassigned fund balance or setting in a reserve. If it doesn't have a policy on how you use it and how you replenish it,
The
then it doesn't
policy
have any
seems
benefit.
pretty clear to me.
Okay.
4 to 7% of general fund budgeted ongoing revenue will be maintained as a minimum unassigned fund balance. That is
pretty clear.
crystal clear to me. that there's no variation from that. We will maintain it, period.
But the
And it's not intended to be used in cases of economic emergency or,
That's what the other reserves are for.
that's what the other reserves are for. This is maintain that amount of cash at all times in your account so you can cover your cash flow. That's how I understand it. Am I understanding it wrong, Mike?
It does sound like a will versus a may. I mean, we talk about shalls and things of that sort.
Right.
This is a will maintain for between
Right.
4 and 7. So we do have a floor. We
Of
do have a floor of
Of
4.
4%.
well,
or not.
If we do, I mean, the way it's written right now,
But
there's a floor of 4%.
And we've said if we want to push that to 7, we're comfortable with that. Just know that you're going to lock up
3% of your money.
well, that's
3% of
my
your money.
point, right? Because I could take whatever. If you set a hard floor here that you said you'll never drive the cash below, right? I could just as easily change the current cash flow reserve to that hard floor number and have this account sitting there that nobody ever touches, right? And it's sitting there with 4% of our money in it or 7%, and you never touch it, right? And our
We've
effort here.
accomplished that.
Our effort here was not to do that. Our effort here was to say, I need this money,
It says that.
but if I need to use it, there's a way to use it, and there's a way to
He
get
wants
it
a
back.
policy that state if we're gonna go below 4%, we have to have a reason to go below 4%, and then how do we get it back? He just wants a.
It says we
Well-
will maintain it.
Right.
But-
It's not an
So it
option.
can't
But his
go
point
below.
being
But
is
that's
that
my point.
at
I don't want to
4%, we've
maintain
said
it
we
at
created a
4%.
You might go down to
percentage.
2 if necessary, and how to get back up to 4.
I'm telling you, you need to have it. That's why we have it at 4%. That's our
'Cause you
cash
don't
flow
wanna go below
fluctuations
4%.
plus. Our normal cash flow fluctuations plus.
I understand.
Let me try to explain what I think I understand what he said. We have an unassigned fund balance now that's at 10% or
Whatever-
whatever the
No,
number
There's
is.
there's
Who
no
cares?
policy.
There's, but no policy on how we use it. But we,
Or what you
but
have
it's
to have it,
there.
how much you have to have
We
in.
just
It's
have
just
it,
a
right?
balance,
Or the
right?
cash, it's
Right.
our cash
There's
flow.
a cash flow reserve.
Our cash flow reserve is at 10%. We're trying to get rid of that because we want to be able to use that money instead of it just sitting there. If we set a 4 to 7%, we've artificially created a bottom of 4% cash reserve.
Yeah.
That we're trying to get away from that.
Why?
Because
and
you can't
hold on,
use
hold on,
it.
Hold on. Let me get there. I'm almost there. I think I know what he's talking about. He wants to have a policy that says, okay, we have it there, but we may need to use it. How do we use it, and how do we replenish it once we use it? Correct? Is that what you're talking
You
about?
don't wanna use it.
Yeah, that's,
But if we
that's
have
the
to-
point. That's why it says, though not a designated reserve, the city shall maintain an adequate amount of working capital, because it's working capital to cover cash
You are
flow.
using it as cash flow.
That's how you use it,
You are
is
using
cash
it.
flow. And when you have it between 4 and 7, if you go from 7 to 6.5 in November because you haven't received December's property taxes, but then in December you go back to 7, then yeah, you've stayed within the range and you've maintained a minimum unassigned fund balance.
And there's, honestly,
And
there's
you've used it for its intended purpose, which is covering cash flow.
But you
in that.
but you haven't gone below 4%.
Correct. Which is what you don't want us to do.
But if we
No,
do, but if
that
we
wasn't.
do,
But I think we're saying we do want to be able to do that. We should have the ability to do it if we need the money.
So here's the point.
So
I
say
was-
that we didn't get, our revenues went down, we're only maintaining 4% in there, and we have to spend it. So at some point, if we spend money, we're gonna drop below the 4%, right? If we have to use
you
it
have
for
an
something.
economic uncertainty reserve for that.
So why do I have a 4%?
floor.
It's just normal cash flows. That's what this is. It's working capital. You're gonna have enough money in your checking account that will take into account the difference between you writing your mortgage payment and you getting your paycheck.
Right.
There may be a 4-day difference. That's what this is.
Okay. So tell me
This
what.
really, this does work.
So it could
makes
drop
sense.
below 4% for a few days until you get the next.
100%.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But so we can drop below 4%.
I'm setting this literally on July 1st of the year. I look at the budgeted revenues and I tell Robin, I need 7% in that on July 1st. That's it. She literally on the accounting, this isn't in the bank account or anywhere else, this is just in the accounting. She moves money within the fund balances to make sure that we hit these targets.
So we can't drop below 4%, it's not a reserve.
but that-
We'll
again,
bounce down there,
I'm
but
not-
then
I don't-
replenish it the next.
I'm not doing accounting transactions throughout the year that adjust this amount that show whether it's
Right.
4 or 7%.
Right.
This is literally, I'm picking a target of, well, this is my fund balance on
Gotcha.
July 1st, and that's what I manage.
I understand it, I get it.
It does work.
Well, so the point is that we set a target. I don't know how you do that exactly, but okay. But
He knows how much cash he's gonna need all the time, right? Through your,
Do daily cash flow.
yeah,
And
he
then
knows
we've got
daily how
projections.
much cash he's gonna need. He tells Robin, hey, I see in 2 weeks I need this much in this account, which may be 6%. Make sure there's 6% in there. She moves the money in, or whatever the number happens to be, I don't know what it is. And you may spend it down, and then it gets replenished back when the revenue comes in. It's like, I get it, it's like your checking account. It's gonna bounce above and below, and
I just need clarification. In the current policy, we have 2.5 million in the capital reserve. Where's that getting reallocated to?
that's a different. We haven't gotten
So
that
we've
one
got
into that
two-
one yet.
We've got 2 other policies now that
Yeah.
the council adopted last year that requires us in our operating budget to fully fund the facilities fund and the capital projects fund based on all of our needs to maintain our roads at a certain level, all of our curved streets, gutter sidewalks, and our facilities. We did a formal facilities assessment, and it's to fund all those things to maintain them at certain levels in our operating budget. So we move the money out of the general fund, it's in our expenses, into a facilities fund and a capital projects fund. So I don't need it here in the general fund.
Okay.
because it just sat there and did nothing. You couldn't touch
Well,
it.
anyway, that's a different discussion. I would like to finish the other one
Yeah.
first, okay, if we could, right? So how do you, so let's take this paragraph, right? Really, this last paragraph sets the policy for the use of the unassigned fund in order to manage cash flow, right?
It's cash flow and opportunities. You may wanna buy a piece of dirt to build a parking lot, so that 3% between the 4 and the 7 is $1.2 million. You may wanna do something, with there's
Right.
opportunity there, it's unassigned.
Right.
Could be for something that comes up.
Okay, so here's my question. When I read it, it says you maintain adequate cash flow. Okay, I'm all with that. Then it says generally an amount equal to about 4% to, right now it says 10, but whether it's 7 or 10, right? It doesn't matter. Of general fund budgeted ongoing revenue be maintained as a minimum unassigned fund balance. So what does minimum mean, being that the minimum on any given day can be 0 to any number above it,
Budgeted
right?
revenues. It's a number that you approve in the budget. So even if revenues come in short, we still have to fund at that level based on the budget. It's one time a year I do this.
So
I don't adjust it as revenues are coming in throughout
so
the year.
basically during the course of the year, this number could be anything, right? It is not. It
This
is not a.
based on a budget. It's a percentage. We're pulling out of the air based on what the different factors that we know with cash flow and other things. So is the 9% and 11% on the other reserves, and it's based on next year's projected budgeted revenues. And we carve up the fund balance and we put those amounts in there. And the only thing that changes throughout the year on a daily basis as we're writing checks and getting deposits would literally be the unassigned fund balance. It goes up and down every day, but our designated amount that we have to have in there on July 1 is the amount based on percentage of the budgeted
So
revenue.
this is a budget number, not a reserve number, right? Just it tells you nothing about how much cash we have on hand at any given time to respond to anything with, right? I mean, if this is a once a year number that you set to manage to, right? On any given day, it can be anything, right?
Yeah. It's unassigned fund balance. It's literally, it's
And
a
it could-
checking account.
It could, and
How
so
much-
it could
how
be,
much do we have
it
in
could
our
be
checking
$1 or $20 million, right? I mean, there's no floor to it, actually, right? There's a floor to the budget number, there's not a floor to the operating number.
But isn't that essential by
What?
definition, with cash flow going up and down? You may have a 10,000 or $100,000.
Right.
That's somebody I need to talk to.
So. Right, but basically, we are positioning it in our overall communication as a reserve, right?
This is a budget.
Right, and it is clearly not a reserve, right? Right, the amount of money in it will be whatever the amount of money in it is, right?
But it's,
I mean, there's no money reserved there, right? There's
Well,
no
I
money
get-
set aside in an
it's just
account.
a bank account.
Right,
It's just a bank account.
right.
It's not a reserve. They've never said that it was a reserve.
Well, if you look at how they position the amount we have in reserves, they're adding it in, so. It gets added in as a reserve, right? That's ultimately. We're reducing the reserves by 10%, right? We're taking out the 10% cash flow reserve and saying, I don't need that reserve, right? I free up the money and use it because I don't need that reserve. That's what
Well,
we're
it's got
saying.
no
right?
limits if we don't have any targets for funding in the unassigned fund balance, then it makes sense to have a cash flow reserve. So right now in our current policy, I could budget everything so that there's $0 in the unassigned fund balance. And I'm not gonna worry about bouncing checks because I still have to have fund balance
Right,
for cash flow.
right,
I've replaced that with the unassigned fund balance.
right. But the unassigned fund
Okay,
balance,
the 10% we don't need.
right.
So if you're talking about, is it a problem reducing that? Only politically.
Well, maybe it's political, I don't know. It seems to me that there's a difference
Doesn't make
though.
business sense to have it.
In that if I fund 10% and I have it in the bank and setting in that reserve and it's in the bank, right? And I know that any given moment, if you ask me what I have in terms of could I cover it, I have 10% of my revenue setting in there for cash flow in case it's needed, right? I mean, that's what that reserve does. It says it's setting there,
Going
right?
back,
Well, this
40
does the exact same thing.
going back
but
4
between
years,
4 and
our most upside down
4%
day
Right.
was 2.5%.
Yeah, I understand that you say that it doesn't vary by 10%. I'm okay with whatever that number is. What I was asking was how the setting a fund balance differs in your overall thing was because the amount in the bank at any given day is whatever it is, and it's not 10%, and it's not, it could be
If I have
2%, 1%,
if I have a
or
funding requirement,
15%.
whether I call it unassigned fund balance or cash flow, if I have a funding requirement, it's a reserve.
Well, I don't know how you could get there.
I easily say that.
Okay.
It's a reserve. I have a requirement that I budget for having that much money in there. And if my budget's gonna show that I'm not gonna be able to hit it, I'm gonna have to change something else so that I can.
So how do you manage that? I mean, because as you said, you're going to spend it down to
The
1%.
same way you manage the cash flow reserve currently. The cash flow reserve is 10% of revenue.
Yeah, right.
This is 4 to 7% of revenue. It's the same thing.
I set it on July 1.
Oh,
It's no different.
I think what Paul is saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is when we had the cash flow reserve, it was always at 10%. We never touched it. It just sat there. It didn't fluctuate. It didn't do anything. We still used our general fund unassigned fund balances to write checks, correct? So basically, we're removing this 10% and putting it back into our unassigned. What do we call it?
Well, we do whatever we want
Whatever
to do
we call
with
it,
right?
wherever it goes.
Which is when you asked earlier
all-
about how we got $5 million to fund this or whatever, right? That's where it came from.
I know exactly where it came
Get the
from.
answer.
I know exactly where it came from, but that's his point. Is that 10% reserve is now gone because,
But it's
it,
not
but it's
gone.
not.
It's not gone.
Just move from one
it-
bucket to
that's-
another.
It moved over into here at
Retitled.
4 to 7%.
It's retitled something
A
else.
new title on it.
Correct.
Right. It,
It's Levi's and Dockers. I mean, it's pants.
and so what really went away was the unassigned fund balance, not the cash reserve.
Well, there's-
Well, the
And we
unassigned-
just moved that
we're
unassigned
now
fund
creating a
balance.
policy around unassigned fund balance.
Right.
Yeah, he's basically saying I'm gonna create a policy around unassigned fund
Which was
balance
recommended
to,
by GFO.
manage it in this range, right?
And it was recommended by
But-
GFOA
And
as the best
if I
practice.
manage it in this range, I don't need the reserve.
Right.
That's basically what it says.
But it is a reserve, in Mike's, by Mike's definition, because he's required to have a certain amount of money in it.
And by the way, all of these
I
are
think they can-
designated accounts. We call them reserves, they're designated accounts.
I understand.
On any given day, the city council can say, we wanna spend every dollar on doing anything they wanna do.
I
There's
understand
no
all of
legal
that, right.
requirement. And
Yeah,
under accounting terms, they actually call them designated accounts. We call, in fact, if you look in our CAFR, in our annual financial reports, the auditors, the terminology we have to use in the fund balance footnote, you won't see emergency reserve or cash flow reserve as a reserve. Because they know it's a council designation, there's no legal requirement.
Well, ultimately,
Okay, so we're kind of going round and round on this.
right, I was gonna say,
We're going round and round.
Right.
My question is, Paul, what would you like to see it say? Because you have an idea behind how you'd like to see this read.
well, I just wanted, you know, if we're going to basically, you know, ultimately, my issue is more about clarity than it is about Jack, right? If I'm doing away with the 10% reserve, I'm just doing away with the 10% reserve. I mean, ultimately, I'll manage the cash flow by holding the balance at this amount. We can add it in, you know, to the number, but it's a different beast.
Well, yeah.
No.
It's
Not- yeah,
it's
no.
the same. The
It's the
different
same
beast
thing.
is we took what we were calling cash flow reserve, of money that we couldn't touch, and we're gonna utilize that. And so we're moving that into a 115 trust or whatever we end up doing with it,
It's the same.
and we're gonna utilize it for something
So
else.
if we
Well,
wanted,
but
if we
it's-
want, if we
but it's-
wanted some clarity, it'd probably be good to delete the word about. Because it says generally an amount equal to about 4 to 7%. About's probably not a very precise number.
As you say, it's not a very solid
Right.
So,
amount, right?
Thank you.
and if the idea is this money is set aside and meant to be used to manage the ebbs and flows of cash, our obligation is to fund it at the beginning of the year at 7%. And the only variation within that range of 7 to 4% is to manage cash flow.
Right.
And that's what this does. Nothing more, nothing less, right?
But
And then we will have accomplished what our current cash flow
Right.
reserve doesn't really do for us.
right. Well, so the clearer way to, in my mind, looking at this is to say, okay, so if we're going to take that essentially 10% and put it into unassigned fund balance and manage our within unassigned fund balance. I mean, right now, the reason why when we talked about putting the number at 10% was because that basically said we're going to stay where we are. Okay, your belief, which I don't have any argument with, basically is that that 10% is more than we really need. We would never use it. If I set the target at 7, let's just say. Now we've dropped our reserve 3%. That's okay. If we decide that it's a wasted money and we decide to drop it, we would drop it, right? I mean, it's just, you know, a decision we can make. But if you're going to then say, and basically, if you could either get rid of the 4% and saying, you know, 7% is my target that I manage my fund to, and it will, you know, or if you have the 4%, it needs to say, if I have to go below 4%, raise it. If I drive it down and I use more than 3%, so now my cash flow is, or my reserve is down below 4%. I want to raise a flag and say, you know, we should come back and visit like you would if you triggered a use of a fund and policy. I'm not sure that's necessary, but I'm just saying, if you have 4% in there as a floor, it ought to trigger something, right? If you hit the floor, it ought to say, there's something's.
So another sentence at the end that says, in the case of an extreme event that drives this unassigned fund balance below 4%, the city manager shall present a plan to the city council within 180 days to replenished within a year, but no later than 5 years. Essentially similar to,
Yeah, exactly. My
Your
point is,
replenishment
paragraph.
if 4% really is a threshold that you don't want to cross, then it should say, well, of course we can cross it because that's why you have it there, right? But if you do cross it, then we will need to have a replenishment plan, or we could get rid of it and say, I just don't need it.
Like,
Either
let
way,
me understand this.
This says don't go below it,
Yeah.
period.
But if,
It's a hard line.
but
But
say
it-
you did, say, for whatever reason, I'm not saying you would ever do this, but you made a miscalculation. Instead of needing 6%, you needed 7%, and you only funded at 6%, and it dropped it down to 3%. Don't you have revenues coming right back in that are going to bump it right back up over the 4%?
I have revenues coming in, but I've got expenditures going out.
Right.
So
my only thing is, if you set a floor,
you,
the floor, I mean, right now, the reason why we don't like the cash flow reserve is it's a set of money we can't touch, right? And that's not very useful to us.
it's just as effective having it in unassigned fund balance if you have to carry a balance. I'm,
Well, my
because
point
that
is,
is our checking account.
right. My point is that
It's-
setting 4% aside that you can never ever touch under any circumstances
You
doesn't
can never
seem.
spend it on something that's not already in the budget that's balanced. Okay, that's all
now,
it's saying.
now I think I understand what Paul's saying is in the
The way it's worded
in
is you
the
created a 4% reserve
Armageddon
that you can't touch.
example that
Everything's off the table at Armageddon.
I know, but in the Armageddon example where cash flows drive you below 4%, there should be something that says it triggers a flag that says you got to do X, Y, and Z.
Well, if you
This
put the floor
says
there,
that.
you should say that floor.
This says that. It says you will maintain it.
No, but he's saying if you happen to dip below it, then
He
you
wants-
have to
he
have
wa-
a plan
We
to
want
deal
a
with it.
reassurance
Because
that
I
it's,
could,
This
that
is
there's a
will,
plan
right.
in place.
I know.
I could, but I don't think. I mean, ultimately, I could take the current cash flow reserve and say we're going to reduce it to 4%. And now I got 4% money sitting there that if it's access it does today, we'd never touch, right?
You should never touch it. You're always going to have bills.
Right. But then I could take my unassigned fund balance down to 3% and drive it from 3% to 0, and as it moved back and forth, and I'd be okay, right? It's the same difference.
You can't
No.
propose a budget that doesn't have this money in there. It's not about operating on a daily basis. This is the budget he's proposing, that has to have it in there. And he can't spend money that you don't appropriate. You're not appropriating money that isn't in a balanced budget. I'm
I
missing
didn't
the point.
unbalance the budget. I guess my question is, right now, we're trying to do away with account because it's not useful to us, right? This 10% that's set aside isn't useful to us. That's the statement, right? The 10% cash flow
It is
reserve.
useful. Cash flow, some of it is useful, and we're taking care of the useful part of it in this policy.
Okay, so how much of it's,
But
But-
you don't, for your checking account, you don't designate part of it to be cash flow.
right?
You've got a checking account, you have to balance.
But here we did designate part of it to be, and we said we never touch it, right? Do we touch it or do we not touch the 10% that's in cash flow reserve?
We probably touch it, the most we've touched in the last 4 years is $436,000 was our biggest day. Where
But we
our-
never touched it because we used unassigned fund balance.
Yes.
So if we never
I've
touch
never
it-
adjusted, the only accounting entries that you'll see on our cash flow reserve is on July 1 every year when she sets the new amount at 10% of revenues.
Right, right, and so it's not useful to us.
Yeah.
Right. And
It's-
if we
it's
put it
an
at 4%,
extra
it
layer
wouldn't be
that you
useful
don't
to
need.
us either, right?
Sorry?
And if we put it at 4%, it would just be a smaller number, but not any more useful to
It's
us, right?
closer, it's the biggest day is close to 2.5% of our budgeted annual revenue is what we were upside down. So if we have 4% in there, I've got our worst day the last 4 years plus a buffer.
So then why do we need a range of 7?
Well, again, now that it's unassigned fund balance, you don't wanna have no money.
Right.
There's, something will come up, an opportunity hopefully, or you wanna do something and there's money. Let's spend unassigned fund balance to get that special study done, or, like last year we decided we're gonna do a community survey now that we haven't been doing community surveys. And it's like, okay, it's not in the budget.
Let's
How do
buy
we do this?
Ossenmacher Gulch.
Yeah.
Right.
There's,
My point being exactly that, when that opportunity came, right, and if that opportunity were to drive our cash flow below 4%, would
Okay.
we pass up that opportunity because it would drive, or would we do
yes.
it and drive the
It would-
cash
it
flow
would not be-
below
it-
and then put a,
Under this policy, you would
Yes,
pass it up.
you would pass
Right.
it up. You don't have the money. You're basically saying,
Right.
I need that money for my normal cash flows.
right.
You might then decide, okay, we're not gonna do this that we planned on doing and take money from somewhere else in the budget.
I just don't understand how I need money for my normal cash flows that I can't spend. If it's not touchable, it didn't help me with my cash flow. That's the problem I'm having with it, right? It either can be used or it can't be used. Now, if we're using it, it'll drive it below 4%.
I am setting the budget every year, and the budget we propose is gonna show that we've taken into account everything. We funded the reserves, and the cash flow reserve, and the unassigned fund balance will be funded at this amount. If we've gotta adjust expenditures in order to hit that, so be it. But we have to present a budget to you that has that in
Mike, I
there.
think what he's saying is the 4% now is not touchable, so it's a cash reserve I can't spend. But for this
your
policy,
budget, I have to fund it.
but I can't spend it.
I'm using it throughout the year. You're not spending it. You're just using it for flow.
Well, I guess I'm having trouble between spend and use then. Maybe that's the thing, right? Use and spend seem like the same.
Sorry.
Sure.
I think what you just said kind of cleared it up for me, because I was a little bit kind of in no man's land as well. There are cash flow fluctuations,
Yes.
and those cash flow fluctuations mean I have a budgeted $10,000 coming in, but it's not coming in right now, so I need to have this 4%
Right.
to dip in to get that $10,000 until that comes back, and it's gonna be fluctuate from, it's budgeted for 4, so if our budget's $100 million, I got $4 million in there, and I might peel off 75 grand here, then 75 grand comes back in, I might peel off 60 grand, 40 comes back in.
That's what I was saying
then another
before,
30
it'll
comes
come back.
It'll come back and.
If I
It'll
spend
come back.
it, it comes back from somewhere
Because it's
else.
budgeted, otherwise it
Right.
has to show up in a variance report
Right.
someplace or taken from someplace
Another way
else.
another way to look at it would be if we have zero requirement for unassigned fund balance, and we take it down to zero, we're still writing checks. Our cash flow coverage then comes from the emergency reserve and you're still, and then you hope that you don't have to spend all of those on the same
So
time.
to your point, so right now there's 4% and then there's up to 7, 3 more on top of it, right? So what you're saying is that fluctuation will happen in this
3%
area
band.
between
7 and
4 and 7%. Paul's point is, I can't touch
Touch the
anything
4%
down here in
below it.
4. Mike's point is, yeah, you don't want to unless you want to. And when you want to, then you can.
And
But
what I
that
want to know
creates a
is
reserve that's just
how
like
to
the cash
use
flow reserve
when we
now,
want
when it's at
to, how do we
10%.
do
so
it? That's my point. I want to have a thing that says, but when you want to, we should know that
So
that it's the right thing to
When you want
do.
to, we say.
How do we set the?
When we say the fiscal impact section, when you wanna do something and you're gonna amend the budget to do that thing, we'll say in the fiscal impact section, and we're spending unassigned fund balance, and we're gonna maintain it at 4%. And if you wanna go below the 4%, we're gonna say, we need to
Waive
amend
the
the
policy.
policy or waive it, which I don't see that I mean, it could happen. We could,
In Armageddon, it could happen.
But we could do that with the cash flow reserve right now too.
Correct.
So basically, Paul's point is made, I thought I understood it. You went from a 10% cash flow reserve to a 4%. And the only way you can spend that 4% is to amend the policy.
Yeah.
talking about something that I don't ever foresee happening. I've been doing this for 30 years. It just, I think we're,
But ideally, we do it once, and we don't ever have this conversation again for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
I mean,
Maybe none of us will
ultimately-
ever
But I think I thought I understood you, but
Yeah, I mean they
you've
just
just changed it
reduced.
from a 10 to a 4.
Yeah, basically that's what they've done, and that's okay. I mean, if we decide that's okay, it's okay. But that's the end result is you've moved the cash flow reserve from 10 to 4, and you said that's enough, and you can't touch the 4.
then you're gonna keep trying to fund, you're gonna keep funding at the 7, so that you've got opportunity money before you get to the 4.
Right. Right.
Right.
Well,
Our goal is to fund it at
whether you can put it in the unassigned balance or you left it in the cash flow account at 4, it's the same difference, right? There's 4% money there that you.
Yes.
If you decide to spend $1 million during the year, so some of that 3%,
Yeah. From
the next proposed budget's gonna have
Back to 7.
back to 7. We're
Right.
gonna have to adjust something to get back to 7.
Yeah, understood, right.
Yeah.
But,
But,
Anyway.
And
but
so-
this says will fund at 4 to 7, and the stated policy, or the
Right now
stated
it
policy,
says-
we're gonna fund at the top of the range.
so the, so whether that floor is set at 4 untouchable or it's in the cash flow policy at 4 untouchable is, I mean, ultimately, that's just a matter of how you wanna account for it, right? I mean, the money's sitting there, there's 4% that's sitting there for cash
Well,
flow
that's,
purposes.
but that's if we say 4%, right?
Yeah,
If we say 7, then you have to keep it funded at 7%.
I'm
No, he's got a
recommending
floor
the
at
4 to
7.
7.
yeah, he's got a floor, cause he's gonna fund at 7 and spend down to 4 and then
If he
replenish. I
need
mean, his
If we need it.
variation's
We'll
gonna
only
be
spend it down if we
3%.
need it,
Oh, what is it?
right?
Yeah.
We'll only
No,
spend the
it's-
7 down to
But
4.
as a
if we
normal
need it.
course of events, you need
Yeah,
to
but
take it.
you're not really spending it, you're just using
Using
it
it
through the
to flow.
ordinary
Yeah, because you have the
fluctuation.
other
Because
flows
you're
are
gonna
gonna come
begin
in
and
and
end the year
replenish.
at the same number.
Yeah.
But in between, you may be
Yeah.
somewhere in the
Right.
middle, but at the end, you'll be back at
It's the same thing
7.
we
So
did
what
with
I'm trying to make
Joseph
sure I
and
am clear on
But when our-
Okay,
is
this is
in
when our
the,
revenues
in
come
the
in,
middle,
we
at
only
the,
get
at
two
the beginning of
allotments a
7,
year.
at the end of
Right.
7, right?
Yep, and
If I've
we
done my
use
job
life for
well.
that.
Yes.
In
So
the middle,
once our
it's
cash flow, we
moving
run
up
out
and
of
down,
cash
right?
because we did something, we go
But
to
as
our
it
life
moves up
fund,
and down,
borrow from
it
ourselves.
can move
take
down
care of
as
it, and
low
put
as
back in
4,
when
but not
revenues come
below
in.
it, is that
Correct.
right? And
That's
then,
exactly what we
or
No,
can,
while it's moving, it can move down to 0.
right,
I'm not good, but I'm not gonna bounce checks.
Yeah.
But when I propose the next budget, and we go to start the next fiscal year, it's getting funded again.
Right.
so there is no
But-
minimum.
No, on a fiscal policy, on a fiscal impact, on a decision the council makes, if it goes below 4, we're gonna be having a discussion, how do we keep it at 4? So we might spend on an assigned fund balance that 3%, and then we're gonna look for somewhere else in the budget to move the budget to cover whatever the difference is for the council.
And that was the other thing I was gonna get to, the other 3% that we said we're not gonna save, and we're gonna move that over to the, what we call that?
Community investment.
Community
That's
investment.
beyond all this,
That's money that we could easily take back out and fund. I mean, I look at that as another account that we can actually backfill.
All
out
money
of.
we're not using for operations.
Well,
Exactly.
not necessarily, okay, we'll come to that too, when we get to that, go, okay, and I'll,
We've got 10 minutes, Paul.
okay. Well, so, I still don't know whether we have a floor that we can't go below, or whether, I mean, so, what do you, what does the 4 mean then? What is the 4%? Does it mean at the end of the year you won't be below 4? Or does it mean on any given moment in
On
time you
July
won't be below?
1st, we're gonna be at 7.
Okay,
During the year, so that's the budget you approve.
right, okay,
During the year, if you decide to spend some of that 4 to 7% range amount, we're gonna let you know, you're spending some of your unassigned fund balance, which takes us budget-wise down to not below 4. If you're gonna spend below 4, we're gonna be talking about taking money from somewhere else in the budget. This is a budget, this isn't, I think you're looking for the mechanics throughout the year, this is a budget.
well, the reason why is because we're
Let me
talking
just say
about like a
more
reserve.
simply,
Yeah.
fourth floor.
Four.
That's the bottom line.
Four is the
But
floor.
basically,
Four is the
4 is
floor.
the floor, not in what's in the account, but what's in the budget,
Yes.
right? So basically, the account could be 0.
On any given day.
on any
Today,
given day,
but
right?
tomorrow it's
Because of
back
the
to 4.
fluctuations
Right,
of
and
cash
that's what it
flow
is, it's how
building.
it's how our revenues come.
It doesn't vary between 7 and 4, it varies between, I mean, up above 7 and all the way to 0.
Budgetarily, it could fluctuate between 7 and 4 based on council decisions.
Budgetarily, right, but not, yeah, so, which is a very different thing than having it setting in a reserve where it's actually in the bank and it's there to spend any day you wanted it, right? Because it wouldn't be there the day you had it at 0, right? If we needed cash the day you had it, it would happen to be at 0, it would be at 0.
But that's what the other reserves are for.
Well, maybe, but that's okay,
I
but
mean, it's,
anyway.
If we don't have think I'm getting, because again, I think I understand your concern that on any given day, that could be, it could, if we get, let's assume $100 million budget, so it could be budgeted for 7. We wanna try and stay between 4 and 7, and the city council could say, let's put in a new park for $1 million. Let's buy a piece of property for $2 million. Now we're at that floor of 4. But we are missing some tax payments are coming in, or something's happening, or we had some type of uneven cash flow. So it could go from 4 million down to 3.9 million, back up to 4.1 million, down to 2.5 million 2 months later, and then back up to 3.7, and then back up to 4. But that's kind of what happens in business. I mean, you can't match the expenses and the revenue specifically. So,
I'm not disagreeing with that. I mean,
but we don't have.
understand that.
But it could go. But it could go down. We do not have a 4% reserve. We have a 4% target budget
Right.
amount
That's
that will
a good word for it.
Well,
Target.
target maybe.
Right. And that's, I
So
guess
I want to understand this as well.
Yeah.
well, which is my point. The reserve right now sits there, and I mean that's money in the bank, right? This target money is not money in the bank. That's money in the budget, right?
It's targeted cash flow variance dollars.
Right. And it can be, the money in the bank can be any number from 0 up, right? So
Is everybody okay with that? I mean, that's how we've been operating? Is that how the city's been operating?
well, the city had a cash flow reserve of 10% set aside. So
And it was
they
doing all of that out of the
operated
unassigned
against the
unassigned
unassigned
fund
balance
balance.
fund, but there was 10% setting aside in a separate account
That
that
just
wasn't
sat there.
being used.
And
So-
do we still need that? I mean, apparently, is that the
Well,
political
basically,
question?
the real response is, we don't need it, we're gonna do away with it, I mean, ultimately.
Yeah, the policy switches from having an emergency reserve and a cash flow reserve to having an economic stability reserve, extreme event reserve, and then having
Yes.
requirements to fund the unassigned fund balance for the working capital, so. I mean,
That seems to be workable, and
it's the
ultimately,
right-
if we do face some type of horrific cash flow requirement, either by majority or supermajority, the council can override and modify policy.
Well, we also have the LAIF. Everybody keeps forgetting
Yeah,
about that,
which is,
you can borrow against LAIF and pay yourself back, and it's actually probably easier than changing a policy.
Okay.
If we needed it for 30 days or something, you just borrow out of LAIF, and pay it back.
Okay, well,
I
anyway.
mean, there's a lot of ways to skin that cat, but because we have a lot of money sitting around, that was just not doing anything. It was just sitting there in an account that nobody would ever touch.
Well,
I'm
and
trying to
yeah, so
understand
the
where that
purpose of this
number's
whole
supposed to
exercise
be.
is to use the money effectively, right?
Right, yeah, right.
And I'm in agreement with that, I'm just trying to make sure that, we're
I get it.
doing that. So the reason why, on the other question, which is, we don't have very much time left, but the capital, what was it called, the capital something reserve, right?
Improvement.
community investment.
Community investment.
Well, that's what it's called now, but it was called, I mean, what you've done is you've taken the 2.5 mil out of the
That's-
capital.
That's now,
That's in the facility,
that's in the,
what's it called?
it's in the capital, infrastructure policy and the facility maintenance policy. And those have funding requirements actually built into our operating budget now, which we didn't have before.
But there is a capital projects reserve that has 2.5 million in setting there, right?
No,
Right now,
Right,
But it's
in
gonna
the
get
current
moved.
policy,
right,
get rid of that.
right.
We've built in now ongoing funding requirements to pay for all of our streets, curbs, gutters, roads projects, and also our facilities projects.
Right.
That 2.5 million we need $2.5 million for capital replacement, and it just sat there.
Mhm.
Okay,
Well,
so
I-
now we've got policies that say, the Director of Public Works is to come up with a plan to fund our streets program to keep it at a certain level of pavement condition index. It's a rating scale they use, that we have to fund that, and that's
Right.
built into the long-term financial plan and into this upcoming 2-year budget, that we're actually funding those in the budget.
Yeah, I understand. I don't actually think that's what this 2.5 million was for, the way I understood it,
It
but,
was.
so.
It was just never used. There was never any process behind it. It literally, the
Because we
reserve.
took, that,
Here, guys, the
that
reserve-
actually got used one time, and used it on the town center plan, and then we paid it back.
For 13 days.
Yeah,
And that was
we
more.
paid it back.
That was a
I'm
cash
sorry.
flow reserve.
I'm sorry, that was more my making a point that it was.
Yeah, I know,
it
I remember.
wasn't needed.
remember.
So I made, when the council wanted to do town center phase 2, I said, how are you gonna pay for it? And I said, let's use that account. But I still had a policy that says on
Yeah.
July 1, it's gonna be full again. So literally on June 19th, they approved the town center phase 2 with funding coming from the capital projects
Okay.
reserve, and on July 1, the budget had to include
$2.5 million.
to fund it. I mean, it was more my point that it was a policy that was, look, guys, in 2006, when these first reserve policies were established, there was a council person at the time that didn't like a bunch of money sitting in the general fund. So this whole thing was put together to segregate money out to show that we didn't have this big fund balance. That was it.
Yeah.
We've now gone through a process where there's actually rationale behind our policies.
Right.
with the long-term financial plan, the operating budget policy, the facilities maintenance policy, the capital infrastructure policy, and now the reserve policy. There's actually meaning behind all these,
Well,
and they fit together. I inherited policies that they were literally put 20% in emergency reserve and don't talk. There's no mechanism on how you're supposed to use it. Here, we just put 10% in the cash flow reserve, which we didn't need 10%.
I understand all that, we cover that. The issue here is that there's $2.5 million sitting in a reserve, right? Whatever its purpose is, I think, as I read it and looked at it, its purpose was to have opportunity money if something came up that you needed to spend $2.5 million in a capital project because you had an opportunity to acquire something or you had the opportunity to fund something and get over the line or whatever, that money was sitting there, could be used and then had to be replenished, right?
There was
Right. It wasn't to do with
wasn't
parks and it wasn't to do
That
with
was
the
not
maintenance,
it.
right?
This was for future replacement of
And so,
existing
Paul, I
assets.
understand what you're saying, but
There was
Mike
a-
was here for that. I mean,
Right.
There was
you
an
know,
unfunded.
I don't know what the intent
No,
was.
there
when
was an
people
unfunded
created it, 'cause there's no
project
policy
list.
around it.
But
Paul?
it's stated that way.
Well, there was an unfunded project list in the capital project
Right.
fund.
Right.
And the general fund policy said, if there's surplus left at the end of the year, send it over there
Right.
to fund capital projects.
I understand,
And
but
if there's money
that's
left
not
over
this,
out of those
that's not what
fund-
this $2.5 million was. You didn't take this to fund capital projects at the end of the year. It stayed in the reserve.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
the policy said it had to stay in the reserve.
We had to fund it. It
But
was
the-
$2.5 million minimum.
Right. And so its usefulness wasn't to go fund maintenance of the,
That's exactly what its
Facilities, right.
usefulness was. Capital Project Sinking Fund Reserve. This reserve is established to accumulate funds for the future repair and or replacement of existing capital infrastructure. That's exactly what it was for.
the $2.5 million.
8/23/2006.
Okay.
So instead of doing that,
Right.
we now fund it in the operating budget.
Okay. Okay. But I still think you missed the whole opportunity. I mean, because we're setting up this community investment fund, which is just like it, right?
No.
No.
This is
Very
new.
different.
Significantly
This
different.
is to do
Not the
capital
capital.
projects like bathrooms and parks and building new bathrooms and parks or building new parks or, I don't know, parking structure. God forbid we ever have enough money in it to build parking structure, but, or Doheny Village,
Right.
you know, I mean,
But the problem with, well, I
and
guess
so
it
it's
would be
different from
insane.
what that was. That was to fix infrastructure.
Community investment account is opportunity money.
Yeah.
It's a mechanism.
The old capital project fund was not. The community investment account is.
And then this recommendation is that we take 3% of the growth in general fund revenues and actually put it in the budget to transfer it into the capital projects fund and put it into a designated account called community investment. And then we look, with that money, we look at all of our hopes and dreams list and say, what do we want to fund? And then layer on top of that, if there's a hope and dream that you really wanna do, that there's not enough money there, then we get to go back to the general fund budget and say, council directs us, come up with a plan to fund that by a certain date, and we have to work through the budget to figure out how to do it. But this does take not only 3% of the growth in revenue, but also if there is an annual surplus at the end of the year after we close the books, if there's more money than we need to fund those three accounts, the economic uncertainty, the extreme event, and the fund balance requirements for unassigned fund balance. If there's more money left, it gets budgeted over to that community investment account as well.
But a minimum of 3%?
That's
Just
starts with a minimum
just
plus.
plus
Well, it's
whatever
three,
the
it's
surplus is.
3% of the
The
delta.
growth.
Well, right now,
Right.
but
So that's 3% of 1.5%, so
okay, but in
it's a couple
resetting,
$1,000s.
if the council adopts the new fund balance policies with the extreme event, economic uncertainty, and the unassigned fund balance, right after you adopt, if you adopt the budget, prior to June 30, we're gonna transfer about $3.6 million of money that's in excess of those amounts into the community investment account.
Understood, but that's the one-time opportunity money, right?
And then next year on revenue growth, there's another 65,000, and on projected revenue growth for 21, there's another 308,000.
But at 65,000 revenue growth, if you're transferring 3% of 65,000, that's
No.
only $2,000.
65,000
Is
is
the
the
growth.
Of the
3%.
revenue growth?
Is the 3%
For that year,
for that.
budgeted revenue growth.
But it's 3% of the budgeted revenue growth, right?
Yes.
And the revenue growth is 60,000.
No.
Even though,
Revenue growth
these other
is-
reserves only grow based on, if the
To meet the
economic uncertainties has to be set at 11%, we've got 11% today.
Yeah,
On July 1, my budgeted revenue went up. 11% of that growth gets added to that account. I'm not fully funding.
I understand that, right.
So it's the same concept with instead of having the 3%, instead of having a 10% unassigned, having it at 7.
Paul's
you take-
saying that he's asking, is 65,000 all of the revenue growth in 2020, or is it 3% of the revenue
3%.
growth?
I can't take all the revenue growth because of my sheriff's contract.
So we have
Exactly.
revenue growth of $2 million, and we're getting 65 grand.
Correct.
Basically.
Correct.
Anyway,
So the idea was fund your capital through operating and fund your maintenance through operating. Although we're making some investments to get back up to speed because of the facility
Right.
assessment we did. So those are handled through the other policies that the council's already established. The idea on a go-forward basis was to address what Paul's talking about, which is how are we gonna address future capital opportunities through a funding mechanism? And so the idea was through the adjustment of these reserves based on need, you can now set aside not only dedicated revenue, this 3% of revenue growth, but also because of our operating budget policy says you cannot use one-time revenue to pay for recurring expenses, operating expenses. So when we finish the fiscal year, under this policy, any operating surplus immediately moves over to this community investment account, so it becomes that opportunity fund. So you have two ways to fund future investments.
And if the council decides they want, there's a hope and dream project that they really want done,
There's the money.
they have to they've got that as seed money, but if it requires
It's-
more, then we have to go back into the budget.
And go into, so again, if we wanted to spend $2 million on XYZ going forward, any additional ongoing maintenance expenses for that hopes and dreams budget is now gonna be reincorporated into the main.
Yeah, the
operating
policy requires that we take into account ongoing expenses that are added from a new asset being built or purchased.
Yeah, and so if for example, the council wants to build something that's $10 million, and it says, well, we're gonna have to put aside $2 million a year for the next 5 years to do that. Well, that might mean we've got to put aside some one-time money, or instead of 3% of revenue growth, we gotta put 5% of revenue growth. And
So it's
so
maintain it.
what was recommended to the council when presenting this policy was, they've got a capital improvement subcommittee of the council. So in the next, for the next budget cycle, have that subcommittee look at those list of unfunded capital projects that we have and prioritize those so that they can start having a wish list that they're actually saving for. Because right now, you could say, why are you setting this money aside? What are you gonna spend it on? We'd say, we don't know. Future opportunities is about it. Versus saying, no, I wanna build 3 parks and a parking lot and, you know, a fountain or something, and I'm gonna need X dollars for it, and then Mike and Mark go figure out our savings plan and program it out, how we're gonna do it.
So we really didn't accomplish what we needed to today, did we?
Well,
On making our recommendations for the council.
if we adjust if we eliminate the bottom end of the ranges for economic stability and extreme event, because we have the 50%
Right.
number.
And we change
And
the
we-
language to say we shall fund at
Fund
that
at the
level.
top and maintain at the top.
Right.
We delete the word about in the cash flow, so instead of about 4 to 7, actually,
For it, so it shall be.
actually have it specific, right?
It will be.
Are there any other changes that you'd like to see?
So at the end of the year, when we have, I don't want to call it surplus revenues, but
Operating surplus.
operating surpluses. We're saying that that has to go into the community improvement, all of it. Does it make sense to move it all there? I mean, that, we could use half of that to also fund unfunded pension liabilities. We can do a lot, we can do other things with that.
So
Listed
the,
in the uses, it actually says.
Where is it? What page on?
page 8,
It'll say, it says use of funds.
Okay,
So we did leave that as a opportunity, reduction of long-term
okay.
liabilities. So what I would probably recommend if you decide you wanna
Okay, got
use
it.
it for reduction of long-term liabilities would be, let's not transfer it,
Well, that's my
into
point,
this account.
because what
let's
it's saying now is
transfer it
it's,
into the 115 account.
Yeah.
or
yeah,
whatever
but
else.
that's what it's saying right now. We're saying it all goes there, but
This
we have,
leaves the door open to do that, and
Yeah.
even if you haven't decided to do that yet, it gets.
well, what I didn't want it to
transferred.
do is have it automatically go in and not have it come to the council to say, where would you like to put it this year? Does you want to put it in community improvement, or do you
Well,
want to move it over to something else?
Remember, before this came up,
There was no policy.
well, the recommendation from the capital project subcommittee was for next year's operating surplus, put most, if not all of that, into the general plan update.
Right.
And I haven't heard any opposition from the council about that, so we're planning on doing that. But we're gonna present it,
But that's-
we
but
don't
that's-
just automatically do it.
Right, that's my point. I want
Right.
to make sure whatever.
At the end of the day, you
it's
guys have to
presented,
vote.
the council
Yeah, I
has to
don't have-
vote on where that
Right.
I
goes.
don't have budget authority to transfer it from the general fund, so when we close the books over the summer, we come back.
Well, but I
in
was worried that our
September.
policy did give you that, that it would just
No.
automatically go there, it wouldn't be a discussion
I
what
have
we do
to
with it.
get approval from you to increase the general fund budget to transfer it.
Right.
I have to have budget in the general fund to transfer it to the capital
Right.
fund, so.
Okay,
Pretty
all right. I'm good.
You folks should be earning your $250,000 stipends per year. A lot of effort. There's a lot
We
of
didn't get
effort
to that
over
when
here.
we were gonna increase the stipends.
How much money do you have in those reserves?
All right. So I think we need a motion to move it up, right,
With those changes.
with those changes. Anybody want
So
to?
what, so would you recap the changes that we're proposing then?
We're gonna eliminate the words "to aim" when we're saying the council's priority will be, fund at the top of the ranges.
It shall
for
fund it.
economic uncertainty and for,
Extreme.
extreme event. we're gonna eliminate the word about when we're talking about the 4 to 7% range that we will, fund at. So it won't be about that, it will be 4 to 7%. And we're gonna eliminate the bottom of the ranges, again, for the economic uncertainty and the extreme events, since you have the 50% threshold anyway.
So you're gonna still allow it to fund that 4 without
No.
a reserve?
The requirement on it's required that we will fund it.
Between 4 and
But
7.
between 4 and 7.
And that'll
So
be,
No, requirements for us to fund it at 7.
yeah, because that,
Priority will be to fund it at the top of the range. Okay?
Well, again, I would decide whether we're funding at 7 or we're funding at somewhere between 4 and
The
7.
budget,
That's a
the
different-
budgets
that's a big
presented will
difference.
be to say at 7. During the year, the council can utilize that 3%, but the next budget that's presented is gonna be at 7 again. That's the way this is set up. But we don't go below 4 unless you guys
Council's
tell us.
directed.
Yeah.
Yeah, you overturn the policy.
You won't have a recommendation from us to do that. But you can do whatever they get us to do.
I make a motion to go forward with this.
second, anywhere, anyone? Is it gonna die for lack of a second?
I'll second.
All right. Okay, any opposition to this? Not hearing any, we're gonna go ahead, pass this. Thank you guys for all your help.
So,
Congratulations, Ken. Thank you, Diana.
Can we just talk quickly about scheduling? So,
Because we have an adjournment coming, but we don't have next scheduled meeting.
right, so, Mike, what's your recommendation? Because what I'd like to do is meet before we go back to council closing the books for the fiscal, so that we could do both a presentation on the next 2-year as well as the closing the books.
When are you back, Paul?
You're back June 12th?
Yeah, I'll be,
Although,
I'm
a
coming
little,
back on the 12th, so I'll be here on the 13th.
little jet lag maybe.
I would, if, I could also take a little bit separate with maybe individual briefings with these two to walk them through our budget and kind of how things flow as well. Kind of my accounting 101 class that I've done in the past. And then,
Can I take that again?
yeah, I'm not sure what would be presented at the next one. I think even like the last quarterly financials, we can send that to them and start down that path. Not sure there's really anything pressing at this point, but we should maybe set up our first, if we consider this one our quarterly for this fiscal quarter, if you will, that we'd wanna set one up next fiscal quarter. I would generally want it to time it when I've got the quarterly financial report done, which is 20 days after the end of the quarter is what we target for that. So the latter part of July might be a good point, and then we would try and hit the last week of July, October.
Because ideally, we would be here with the FRC going over that before that went to the council, right?
For what went to the.
Before the quarterly went to the council. No?
It's not gonna change the quarterly.
No, but I just think it's important to go through that
Okay.
process.
So we'd want to
Because-
time it somewhere, yeah, the last week of the month, because we're usually hitting the first meeting of the month is our target for the quarterly of the month.
So ultimately, one thing I'd like to see from this group is, as we continue to iterate on our financial reporting, if there are things that we can do to improve it over time, And then probably won't be at that July meeting, we might.
So maybe just, I don't know if the committee's available, the calendars, the last week of the month following a quarter end. So it'd be last week of July, last week of October, last week of January, last week of April, as a normally scheduled meeting.
So, and depending on the timing on when PERS comes forward with their 115, if it's that October meeting, great. If it's somewhat earlier than that, we may want to call a special meeting, because I think we'd just like to walk you through.
And maybe I can add that in my briefing is our actuarial review. I can send you guys the PowerPoint that our actuary did and walk you through it. It'll give you a headache.
Is that good?
When is it? Yeah, sorry.
The last week of July is what
Last
we'll
week
be.
of July.
Jackie will put it
We'll
on
be
your
in touch
calendar.
with you.
Hold on, last week of
And
July.
like afternoon like this, Wednesday, Thursday afternoon?
First week of
Like
August is
4
fine.
4 o'clock is great.
I'm gone from July 26th, I think, until August 4th.
Okay, well, we can, since we're dark in August for our council meetings anyway, that's not that big of a deal if we push it out into
Yeah.
August. but
I'll
we'll
have
look at
Jackie
the
send out meeting stuff to just get everybody's calendar squared away, and so that if we can schedule out like the next, few quarterly meetings, and that way just have them on that calendar and be done. Be good. Is that all right?
Works for me.
Great.
That's just a general, looking at city council operations, when you folks have votes, another 5 people on the council,
There's 5 here.
is it always just simple majority, or sometimes is there a requirement of supermajority?
Sometimes
For
there's
certain-
super.
Turn the meeting.
Okay, go ahead and turn the meeting. So you guys can take off, sorry.
You turn off the.
You want to turn this off?
There are certain things that take a super majority.
And is that